Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and we start out in the direction of Robotyne, where the Russians, according to this geolocated footage, has managed to capture the final fortifications south of Robotyne, securing their southern flank and move northwestern direction towards the new Ukrainian fortifications here to the east and northeast of Robotyne. Fighting continues in the village after weeks of a Russian foothold in the central parts gained through the western parts of the village, and the Russians managed to gain control over the southwestern fortification here in the direction of Robotyne. With this, the southern flank has been fully secured, and it is likely that the Russians will expand their zone of control northeast and also in the eastern direction towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the wedge here in between the Russian positions east and west of those. Front line here in the southern part of the front line has been fairly stagnant over the past few weeks, with only one singular advance by the Russians here within the village and one singular to the eastern parts of the fold. Other than that, there's been no additional advances by either side in this section of the front line. This is mainly due to the fact that the majority of the fighting takes place in the open fields. The Russians are not willing to lose enough soldiers to capture these areas, and the Ukrainians are simply holding on to their positions under fire by the Russians. So we see that there's no significant movement here except for a few Russian armored assaults with a few infantry fighting vehicles where they drop off infantry to launch infantry assaults following those armored assaults. We then move further north in the direction of Krasnoorivka, where the Russians have made a small advance towards the northern parts of the locations that they currently occupy. With this, the Russians are closer to the Ukrainian fortifications in the central parts of the city. The Russians are slowly moving towards the fortifications the Ukrainians have in the area to expand the zone of control and secure their foothold within the city. Heavy fighting takes place in Krasnoorivka as the Russians constantly launch armored assaults across the edges of their zone of control, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to their positions but are slowly being pushed back towards the fortified areas and outside of the city. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of the northwest of Avdiivka, south of Ocheretyne, the Russians have managed to capture the whole village of Novobakhmutivka in one single assault. The Russians captured the village after their advances to the north of Ocheretyne. The Russian advances by Ocheretyne have been very significant. This advance by the Russians was sudden and has caused an imbalance in the Ukrainian lines here in the section of the front line. It is reported that the Ukrainian defensive positions within Ocheretyne completely withdrew and abandoned the village due to the Russian advance and heavy bombardment of the Russians. The Ukrainian soldiers in the brigade defending the village did not have enough weapons and manpower to defend the village, so they decided to withdraw, and instead the Ukrainians sent the 47th Mechanized Brigade to defend the village. They've now retaken positions in the outskirts that the Russians had yet to capture, and fighting continues within the village. Throughout the night, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade took up positions within the village, establishing their defensive positions and holding on to the village. The Russians made a small advance in the central parts, securing the entry towards the village. As the Russian advances towards the village was very shallow, this means that the Ukrainians could counterattack towards the supply line and cut off the Russian contingent within the village. This is why the Russians are now working to expand this shallow supply line to gain a proper flank so that they are able to defend it and hold on to their grip towards the village. They did this by attacking and capturing the village of Novobakhmutivka to the south. With that, they have secured the southern flank, but they also need to secure the northern flank, and it will likely take place by the Russians attacking the eastern parts of the village as well as the fortifications east of the village. This would secure the eastern flank. At the same time, fighting will likely reach the west of Novobakhmutivka, where fighting will take place by the fortifications, as the Russians will look to capture those as well to secure the northern flank. Until then, we'll see additional troops being sent to Ocheretyne to fully capture it, and the 47th Mechanized Brigade, after fighting in village after village after village, is now fighting in Ocheretyne. It is unclear exactly how much attrition that they have received in the fighting, but this could be one of their last battles if this continues, as the Russians' heavy bombardment of the village. In the village itself is a lot of vulnerable positions. If the Ukrainians wish to hold on to them, they'll take a lot of losses, and them using the 47th Mechanized Brigade makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to that brigade as well. The Battle of Ocheretyne will reveal the truth. Are the Ukrainians that desperate to hold on to as much territory as possible to sacrifice one of the few elite brigades that they have, or will the Ukrainians for once prioritize the lives of their soldiers over land captured by the Russians? We will see in the next coming days whether the Ukrainians will withdraw or counterattack or just simply hold their positions in Ocheretyne. The Russians have now secured their southern parts of the village and central parts. They're now going to be moving into the eastern, northern, and western parts of the village, and the main focus will likely be the eastern until they have secured the northern flank of their supply lines. With the capture of Novobakhmutivka, the Russians will likely move on to Solovyovo, which will capture that village as well fairly quickly due to the lack of fortifications in that direction. This will allow the Russians to then capture fortifications south of Ocheretyne. That will allow them to secure the southern flank completely before moving on to hitting the Ukrainian supply line in and out of the village of Ocheretyne, or simply moving in a northwestern direction from the central parts of Ocheretyne to capture it completely by physically cutting it off. The Battle of Ocheretyne here in the northern flank of Avdiivka is extremely important for the following weeks in the west of Avdiivka. We see that the Ukrainians had their 3 lines of defense west of Avdiivka. They had Stepove, Berdishi, Semenivka, Orlivka, Tannenke. The Russians captured Lastochkine, Sheverne, Tannenke, and Orlivka, which moved the Ukrainians on to the second line, which was Berdishi, Semenivka, Umanske, Yestrebrodivka, and Netailove. The Russians are close to capturing Semenivka and Berdishi and have bypassed them to go on to the third line of defense of the Ukrainians, which goes to Ocheretyne, Novobakhmutivka, and so on, all the way here to the western parts. It is likely that the Russians, with the control over Ocheretyne and Novobakhmutivka, would pass over this third line of defense, capturing the northern parts of it, before moving on to the western parts to gain full control over this arch here in between the northern parts of Avdiivka to the lakes here in the western parts and Netailove in the south. At the same time, the Russians will fight over Netailove here to the south, before moving on to Yasnobrodivka and Umanske. Taking control of this entire zone to the west of Avdiivka will allow the Russians to use Avdiivka and Donetsk to develop further offensive operation here in the area. It's unlikely that the Russians will stop their offensive operations and will simply continue pushing through the railways and onwards to Pokrovsk in the west. In the direction of Donetsk through Pervomaisk and Netailove, the Russians will also likely use their advantages here in the area and the control of the villages in the area to push through the western direction through the highway in the direction of Pokrovsk from the south. This will allow the Russians to attack Pokrovsk from 2 directions if they continue advancing here west of Avdiivka. This is why it is extremely important for the Russians to continue their offensive operations and for the Ukrainians to block the gaps and hold back such an offensive. The city of Pokrovsk is the most important city for the Ukrainians in the entire Donetsk region. The reason for that is very clear. The majority of supplies, up to 80%, going through to the front line here in the Donetsk region goes through Pokrovsk. The entire supply lines from Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and everywhere south of the western parts of the Dnieper River goes through Pokrovsk. The only supplies that comes from the north goes through Poltava, Kharkiv, and then down south towards Izium and towards Sloviansk. This is the final 20%. Other than that, there are a few roads and highways all throughout the Donetsk region where trucks supply ammunitions and everything else. But the majority of supplies go through rail, and that rail goes through Pokrovsk. This is why if the Russians capture Pokrovsk, the majority of supplies going through the Donetsk region will be completely cut off. In that sense, it is clear that right now the Russian main focus is here to the west of Avdiivka. The direction of Chasiv Yar, Novobakhmutivka, Krasnoarivka are all secondary advantages that they are attempting to get to improve their chances towards Pokrovsk. But the clear main point is here to the west of Avdiivka, from Ocheretyne and down south to Netailove. This area right here is the main focus of the Russian armed forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, check out my Patreon, subscribe, everything else. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.